And I appreciate Mr. Colby having to take charge for the last couple of ones. One, I wasn't here at all, and then the previous one, I wasn't here much mentally, but tried to be helpful. But he did a great job with that. So we're picking up, I think, in Esther 5, and let's just think about the first 4 chapters of the book. First of all, about what time period are we talking? Well, maybe let's start with this. What Bible period are we in? Return and rebuilding. But what's unique about this story compared to the other things we've been talking about, return and rebuilding? It's in Persia, right? There's not a return. Esther's not rebuilding the temple. When we talked about Zerubbabel and we talked about Jeshua, they're coming back from Babylon to Judah in order to fix the homeland, right? In order to build back the temple. Eventually, Ezra will come back and all that. So where does Esther fit in all that story? You can do timeline, you can do order of events. Where are we fitting Esther in all that? Do what? All right, so when's the temple rebuilt? Do you remember? What year? 516. The way I remember this is 587, 586 is when it's destroyed. Remember, there was the 70-year promise. 516 is when it's rebuilt. Now, the 70-year promise really had more to do with the captivity, but it's kind of amazing, not kind of amazing, really amazing, that 606 is when the first captives are taken. 536, 70 years later, is when they return. 586 is when the temple is destroyed. 516 is when it's rebuilt. So both of those line up right at 70 years. So Esther happens from about 483 to 473. So it mentions that she became queen, I believe it's in the 3rd year of King Ahasuerus. Well, maybe that's when his feast is. I had this in my head earlier. So when does she become queen? Anyway, she becomes queen in about 483 BC. So all of the stuff that happens in the book of Esther basically is wrapped up by 473 BC. Ezra, we took a break from the book of Ezra because he tells us about all this stuff, but he won't lead a return until about 458. And then Nehemiah will come 445. The way I remember this is the first return was to rebuild the temple. The second return was to rebuild the people. And the third return was to rebuild the wall. That's how I remember those things. Temple, people, wall. And then Esther is kind of an outlier here because she's going to be a Jewish woman who's still living in Persian captivity. Everybody with me? Makes sense? Okay. So the reason I do all that is so that we just kind of have a setting for understanding where she is. Now, the reason, I don't know all the reasons why we have the book of Esther in the Bible, but one thing might be for us to consider that while all this is happening in Judah, don't forget there's millions of Jews that are going to be living outside of Judah. So when we come to the New Testament, for example, there's Jews everywhere, right? When they go preach, where do they start? They most often start in a synagogue, right? Because there are Jewish people living all over. That was called the diaspora or the dispersion, where these Jews go all over the place. So here we see Esther kind of in that status. All right. So did you make mention? Maybe you did. Who is not mentioned in the book of Esther? God. His name never shows up. So the Lord, Yahweh, even God doesn't show up in the book of Esther. Well, his name's not there, right? I think what we'll see by the end of night, what I hope we see, is that even though he's not mentioned, we still see him. And I think that Esther is a really good book for us because we are not living in an era where the prophets are speaking to us like they were through Daniel and Ezekiel. And I think Esther was kind of living in one of those moments where she wasn't getting direct revelation about things. Mordecai's not getting direct revelation about things. And yet they must operate still understanding God's will, even though it's not being directly revealed to them. I realize that like Zechariah, Haggai will be back in the land being prophets during, but they will be. He says, you need to consider it may very well be that you are where you are for this very purpose. Now, he had already said deliverance will come from somewhere, right? So we used to sing that song, Christ has no hands but our hands. I like that idea, but God will accomplish his purposes, right? He's going to get it done whether we're on board or not. He's going to have his people and he's going to rescue his people. But it may be, I think it's helpful for us to reflect on this, we don't have certainty about it, but it may be that you are where you are for such a time as this, for whatever purposes that you need to accomplish in that moment. And certainly God could use Esther. So in verse 14, that's the question Mordecai raises.
Right quick, another thing that I did not point out, but I just kind of noticed, and I hope I'm not taking this out of context, but on the flip side of what you just said, it says that if she does not do this, then she would perish with her house.
That's right.
So if you apply that to us today, if we don't do what God sends us to do, if we don't take advantage of our opportunities that he puts us in, well, his will is going to be carried out anyway. But what's going to happen to us?
We're going to perish. Yeah.
Yes.
So I love that at the beginning of verse 14, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Isn't that the theme of the Old Testament in some way? Like when we think about the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we see them in Egyptian slavery, or we see them through the divided kingdom period, or we see them during the captivity period. I mean, over and over and over, it looks like the family of God through Abraham is just right on the brink of disaster. Mordecai has learned the lesson from all that, right? He's done his Bible study. He has been through the Waldron curriculum, right? He knows that they will be delivered, but it may have to come from a different place. But he says, who knows? And I like that approach to providence, right? There are things in my life that I look at and say, I don't know how it could be any other way. But I like that Mordecai here is still saying, who knows? Maybe this is why you're where you are. So we don't read too much into it, but we say we can certainly do good in the position we're in. Now, Esther's words in verse 16, I think, are powerful as well. She says, you go and fast on my behalf. And I think that fasting would be connected to prayer, don't you? Not just not eating for not eating's sake, but out of concern for what Esther's about to do, because she says she's going to go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I will perish. Somebody has made the point, and I think this is good. Esther does serve as a shadow of Jesus here. She says, if I perish, I will perish. Jesus says, when I perish, I will perish. Right? Jesus knew what he was coming to do and went anyway. He knew what it was going to cost. And Esther is saying, it may very well cost me, and was willing to do that. And so she serves, I think, as a great shadow of Jesus in this. So we come to chapter 5, and we don't have time to read all of this text. We're going to try to cover all the way through the rest of the book. But in chapter 5, Esther goes into the king. Remember, this is King Ahasuerus. Secular historians would know him as Xerxes, but we have him as Ahasuerus here. Is that how you were saying it? Ahasuerus?
Ahasuerus.
Ahasuerus.
But you say it the way you want to say it.
When I grew up, we called him Ahasuerus, and it was just like that. But we're going to just go with Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus, whatever. I call him Xerxes.
Yeah, that's what I was fixing to say.
Queen Esther's husband.
Or call him king.
Yeah, the king. So she goes into his presence, and what's the rule? You know the rule. Come the king, unless he holds out his scepter, what happens? You could die. All right. Now, I want you to think about this. Remember Vashti at the beginning. What was the law for her that she disobeyed? Yeah. She was commanded to come into his presence, and she refused. Esther was commanded not to, right? She says, I know this breaks the law, and she comes anyway, right? He was really trying to find an obedient wife, and he didn't, right? He found a beautiful wife, but she was just as disobedient in some ways as Vashti was. And Vashti, he acted like was going to hold pretty powerful sway over the nation, over the empire with her influence. Esther's actually going to hold a lot more power by the end of this than Vashti did. And so it's going to be kind of an interesting account here. I think you kind of see just a reverse of things. So she comes in, And he does, in fact, hold up his scepter. I think we see God's provision there, even though God's not mentioned. It's not that he just so happened to hold up his scepter. It's that God is giving grace in this moment. And says, what do you want? I'll give it to you up to half my kingdom. Now, what does she request? A banquet, right? It's interesting. She does not lead with the request that maybe I would have anticipated her. I forget that when I read this story sometimes, that she doesn't go straight to, hey, deliver my people. She goes to, let's have a feast. You and Haman come to this meeting. And I think she's just trying to kind of set the stage just right for this to occur. So he does, in fact, agree to that. Now, Haman, notice this, verse 9, Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. Haman has no idea what's happening, does he? He's excited. He thinks, I just got an invitation from the first lady, to this dinner. And then he sees Mordecai in the king's gate, which would be a place for counselors and for people who have some rule and authority over the city. And this Mordecai that would not bow down to him. And what happens? What is Haman's attitude towards seeing Mordecai? He's angry. Man, it's one of those things where he has so much, he thinks he's got so much good going on, right? He's been invited to this festival, this feast, I guess I should say, this dinner, this banquet with Esther and the king, and he sees Mordecai, and it just puts a burr in his saddle. He just cannot get over that fact, despite the good that's going on.
I don't know who the most boastful person you would find in the Bible would be, but he would have to rank right up there with the.
He's definitely
the
a
best
contender, isn't he? That's right. That's right. So you've got verse 12. Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast prepared. Verse 13. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He just could not handle Mordecai's presence. And as a result of that, his wife, who seems to be giving him some direction, said, and all his friends, said, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it, then joyfully go with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So Alan was asking me about these gallows beforehand. The word used here for gallows, when we think about gallows, what kind of execution do we normally think about? Hanging, that's right. And you have the word that Haman is going to be hanged up on it, or that Mordecai is going to be hanged up on it. The word gallows here is literally just the word tree. Just the word tree. So it's 50 cubits high. And so the idea would be is that the way you could get this up quickly is you would just take a tree that's already 50 cubits high. What are we talking about? 75 feet? We're talking about 50 cubits. You would have a tree that's 75 feet high. You would just cut off the top of it and you would have your ready-made post. Now, the reason that there's some question is because hanging was not necessarily the way of execution, more like impaling somebody up on top of it. But this same word can be translated pole or beam or anything like that. So the idea may be have Mordecai impaled up on this post kind of as a sign of this is what happens when you mess with Haman kind of thing. You've seen, maybe you haven't seen, that'd be good if you didn't, but like old war movies or something where in the Middle East or something, they would impale people and put them up around the perimeter as a warning to any enemies. That's kind of like what's being done here. At least I think that's probably the indication here. Now, all that is to say, could be gallows, could be a tree that they've just shaved off into a point, could be something like that. That's how it can be made overnight, right? Like, so you talk about building gallows 50 cubits high overnight. That would be quite the job. But just shaving down a tree and impaling somebody upon it maybe would be a little bit easier.
So you think the word
gallows?
Yeah, I'm talking about over in verse 9 and 10, where it says hanged. you think that could be a different type of hang than what we would picture.
Be hanging them up on it, but as through puncturing them
Yes.
up on it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Not necessarily hanged by the neck. Like if it doesn't hang by the neck, I'd be like, okay, can't argue with that. But it could be just lofted up in that way. So all that just to give you a picture of 75 feet high. Haman wants to make a statement with 75 feet high, regardless of how Mordecai is up there. All right. Now, that's chapter 5. We good so far? All right. So chapter 6. This is, I believe, it's the only chapter. Well, I say it's the only chapter where Mordecai and Esther are not having a lot of conversation, maybe since chapter 1. Right? A lot of the rest of the book is Mordecai and Esther working back and forth and talking to the king and all that. Chapter 6 is not really about what they are doing. It's something that happens away from them. Now, they will be mentioned in this chapter, but it's not their activity that's the primary thing. In fact, what happens to the king? What's his problem on this night? He can't sleep. It just so happens that he can't sleep. Oh, man. I think chapter 6 is the hinge point of the book. I think almost everything turns on chapter 6. And it's actually kind of interesting. You can do a study and look at the order of things in the book of Esther, and it's almost like they undo themselves in the exact reverse order through the rest of the book. But chapter 6 kind of serves as a hinge for that. So what does
and this is where it's important to remember from the last class when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, and you might have been, I don't want to steal this from you, but when he was sitting in the king's gate and he overheard the 2 guards plotting to kill the king, and he sent word to Esther to tell him, whose name did Esther give to the king that did that? She gave him Mordecai's name, and it told us there, I think, that it was recorded in the name of Mordecai. Here's where we see the importance of that.
Yeah, that's great. So because he can't sleep, the king goes to look in the record books. And I would imagine that would put you to sleep. That's kind of the goal, right? To look at all these numbers and read a history book puts people to sleep. I know. But all right. So, and he reads about Mordecai turning in these 2 men. My text says Bigthana and Teresh, who had sought to lay hands on the king. And the king wonders what honor has been given to Mordecai. This is a major thing. This is a big deal. And what's the answer? Nothing. So Haman was there. King's right-hand man is there to come in. And so he comes in. And so the king says, what would you do for a man that you want to honor? That's what he asked Haman. Now, what is Haman thinking? He's thinking it's for him, right? This is just like chapter 5. When Haman gets invited to Esther's dinner, he thinks it's all about who he is. When Ahasuerus asks Haman, how do you honor a man you want to honor? Haman immediately says, oh, he's asking so he can honor me, which is kind of a weird thing to just jump to and assume, but that's what we've got in Haman. That's the kind of guy we have. Now, what kinds of things does he say need to be done for the guy that the king wants to honor? Yeah, put him up on a horse. Put him in one of the robes that the crown is king. The crown is worn, that the king has worn.
He wants to look like a king, don't he?
He wants him to look like a king. That's exactly right. Whoever this is going to be honored, Haman's like, whoever it is going to be honored. He's winking at him as he goes, whoever's going to be honored. Let's make him look like a king, make people pass through there and proclaim before him. This is verse 9. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Like, give him as much accolade and attention and praise as you can possibly do. Now, maybe he's waiting with lots of anticipation on the edge of his seat. And the king says, hurry, take the robes, take the horse, and do so to Mordecai the Jew. Oh, man, just hearing that name, I'm sure, just riled him up. But Haman has no choice, and so he does that. And I love this in verse. I don't love it because it's such a tragic thing. But Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. Boy, we have gone from Haman on as high a plateau as he could get to now he's just crumbling. He's covering his head, mourning. So Haman goes on, he tells his wife, he tells his friends all this. And his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. It's like, thanks, honey, for that encouragement. That's pretty brutal, isn't it? But she understands something. She has some kind of insight. And I don't know if this is just like understanding the history of the Jewish people or just knowing Jewish people. But she says, if he's of the Jewish people, it's kind of like what Gamaliel says in Acts 5. Who could fight against them, right? If God be with us, if God be for them, who can be against them? That's not what he says. What does he say? Anyway, he says something of that same idea. Anyway, while they're talking, and she's given this idea that if you're fighting against him, you're going to fall. If your text says, but will surely fall before him, the Hebrew there is falling, you will fall. It's just intensifying the fall. It's going to be pretty severe. So while they're talking, the king's eunuchs arrive to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. All right, so he's got to kind of clean himself up from the morning and all that. He gets to still go to this feast. At least that's good news, he thinks. Okay. Any thoughts through chapter 6? All right, so we see God at work in this, I think. We don't have God's name mentioned, but I think this is one of the primary places, as Mr. Colby may mention, that I think this is one of the primary places where we see God at work. Chapter 6 might be the primary example that I would point to in all that, because here it's not like we just have the wise plotting of Mordecai and Esther. We can't play it off on, well, they were just really smart politicians. That's not what's going on. What we have is something happening that seems just like a stroke of luck, and really it's the work of God behind all this.
But the question the king had for him is probably the only thing that would deter his mind from killing Mordecai.
That's right.
And that's the one question that he
because he went to ask for Mordecai's life. That's right. That's really interesting. That's a good point, because when you think about the context in which Haman was there, it's to ask for Mordecai's life. And so to hear his name be the one called to be put on the horse with the robes, now he's limited on what he can even do for against Mordecai. He can't even ask. Right? You can't even ask for a request against that. It will only be in the Jewish execution that something can happen. All right, everybody good through chapter 6? Good point, Alan. Thank you for bringing that up.
And what's it going to make him look like if he refuses it too?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
So,
to refuse to do that.
Yes.
So make him look disobedient to the king.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, right. So he is really in a difficult space there. So he probably does the smart thing and just goes along with it for the moment. But he's obviously very sad about it. All right. So the king and Haman go to feast with Queen Esther. Now the king asks Esther what her wish is. And he says, this is verse 3. She says, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. I want you to imagine. So first of all, when she's explaining the situation, maybe Haman is already a little bit alerted. But to know that it is in fact Haman and point him in that, like, just imagine the drop here. It would have been a worse one than the Mordecai thing, because now he is being indicated as the one who is behind executing Esther, the king's wife that he is evidently quite happy with, right? Because he has offered her half his kingdom twice. And all she's saying is, just for the life of me and my people. And listen to her request. If you were just selling us as slaves, I wouldn't have said anything. but because our life is going to be taken, I had to say something. And she said, this foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Now, pretty powerful. All right, so what does the king do first? He gets angry, he gets up, he goes in the garden, and there's Haman. And Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. He sees that the king is angry with him, that he's going to do something bad to him. So he's going to Esther and making an appeal. And as he's doing that, the king comes back in. And I imagine, and I'm not going to do it, but I imagine the way that they were eating was not like sitting at a table in chairs. Imagine them, the food kind of being out on the floor and them having like cushions surrounding it. So Esther is like laying towards the food. And so here comes Haman to like approach her and maybe grabs her feet, or maybe he's on top of her in some way pleading with her. And you just imagine how all of that looks. And so the king comes back in, and he was falling on the couch where Esther was, right? Just imagine him kind of like leaning into her. And the king comes back in and goes, "You're going to assault the queen in my house? In my presence?" And so it's just like this idea that Haman, in this pleading process, has lowered himself even further in the king's side. There's no mercy coming now. And so the word left the mouth of the king, and they covered Haman's face. It's almost like they just kind of took him and put him in custody, is how I would take that. Now, it's interesting here. I don't know how this happens, but the eunuch right here, in 1 second, has an answer for what we need to do to Haman, right? It's like he might not have liked Haman, because he has a response so quickly to what to do. And he goes, "Hey, there's some gallows, there's a tree, there's an impalement pole ready for Mordecai that Haman built for him. Why don't we just use that?" And the king says, "Go right ahead." Not just him, but hang him on that. And so that abates the wrath of the king. Okay, and I think when you say that in verse 8, chapter 8, verse 1, gave to Queen Esther to the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and I wonder if that's not. I don't know if that's the family or if it's like the property. I would kind of lean towards the property, but when he says he gave him the house of Haman, I'm kind of thinking that becomes hers. So anyway, okay. Anything through chapter 7?
So it just so happened that gallows was there.
It just so happened that Haman built some gallows. Yeah. What are the chances? Well, and this is a thing, like I think you could compare Esther in a lot of ways to Daniel. God giving, like in the book of Daniel, we see God giving Daniel grace in the eyes of the people that he's working with and under. And we don't have that specifically mentioned here, but I think if you've read the book of Daniel and you just come to the book of Esther, you would say the same things are happening for Esther and Mordecai. They are being honored because of God's favor towards them in the presence of these other people. So the house of Haman is given to Esther. The signet ring, that authoritative, he can mark with the king's authority on things, is taken from Haman and given to Mordecai. You see this great reversal here. So Esther then explains what's going on. So you've got Haman's plan, and the problem is that Haman has this passed as a law that can't be revoked, right? And so that is a challenging situation because you can't take the law back. And so that takes us down to like verse 8. "You may write as you please with regards to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict in the name of the king and seal with the king's ring cannot be evoked." So here's what I think he's saying is, you come up, I can't revoke that law, but you come up with a law that you think will help counterbalance that. And we can sign it with the signet ring, and it'll be locked in, and it won't be able to be revoked either. So they're going to write a law, and they're going to send it out. I love this. From India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. Now, here's a message that's going out to everybody, everywhere. And the message is that the king has allowed these people to gather to kill the Jews and to plunder them. But what they're going to deliver is that they get to be ready. This is verse 13. The Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. That is, rather than having to just give in to the attack that's coming, the Jews can stand and give a defense of themselves. So that's basically chapter 8.
So you mentioned the fact, you mentioned from the India to Ethiopia,
Yeah.
all 127 provinces. The book opens in verse 1
yeah.
with that. When it introduces Ahasuerus, it says that he reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia.
Yeah.
You know, when he sent this out, when I was reading this afternoon again, I got to thinking that would have had to go out to the Jews that were back in Jerusalem also,
Yes.
because they would have been in one of those provinces.
That's exactly right.
So, you know, I kind of wondered what they might have thought about all of this as well.
That is very interesting. And like, I mean, I've never even thought about that. Like when they get the initial word of the problem, that this has been opened up, that it's possible that it can happen. Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to throw you off.
No worries. Okay. Any thoughts through chapter 8? Less than a year, right? Because he cast the lots, and it actually ends up being less than a year. So they send out the announcement. I can't remember the months, but I think it's like
I think it's been 1 year.
Well, it will be 1 year
In the 12th month.
In the 12th month,
yes.
When that decree comes down.
Yes.
Well, when it's allowed to be carried out.
Right.
So all this has to happen pretty quick. I mean, I say pretty quick. Within a year is not that fast, but it is faster.
For a while, they've been thinking they're about to be destroyed.
Yes, exactly right. That's right.
Great sense of relief to know now.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah, at least for some period of time, there was a gap between the initial statement and this.
When you're talking about the Jews back in Jerusalem, they've been blessed with the king's treasure to help build the temple. And this decree comes out.
I know.
That would be.
Yeah, and it seems to me, and I don't know if you talked about this, I didn't get a chance to listen, but I think, I'm not sure that the king knows who is being specified, which nationality is being specified when he writes the law. It seemed to me that it's kind of just Haman saying, hey, there's this group that's really bothering me. There's this guy, there's these people, and the king just says, all right, go ahead. So I don't know how aware Xerxes is, one, of Esther's ethnic background, and two, of who Haman is going after. And when all that gets put together, then that provides protection.
Yeah, I think he was very unaware of it, which again shows God's providence. And I think I did mention the fact that when all of this happened, here you have a Jewish girl or Jewish wife, the queen to a pagan king.
Yes.
Well, now you have Mordecai in the king's house as well. So now you have two Jews.
That's
Of course,
exactly
he knows by this time.
That's right.
But like you said, I don't think he knew when Esther was queen or became queen.
You may that may very well be the case, because I mean, basically, he doesn't care. He's just sending out eunuchs to all the provinces to find the one that he's going to want. So, okay. Anything that you would like to share through chapter 8? All right. So let's look at chapter 9. So this is in the 12th month, which is on the month of Adar, and the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out. On the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. I think that's one of the few passages in Esther where the reverse is just so clearly stated. Their enemies wanted to have mastery over them, but instead the Jews gained mastery over their enemies. That might be a good way of summarizing what's going on in the book of Esther. That might be a good way of summarizing the book itself, is that there were those who were enemies of the Jews who wanted to have mastery over them, but the reverse happens. The Jews have mastery over those who hated them. So what they do is they gather in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm and no one could stand against them, for fear of them had fallen on all people. So this might be another place where we would point to God's power at work here. Even the rulers, verse 3, are helping because Mordecai is in such a high position. The fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. And so you have verse 4, he grew more and more powerful. So in verse 5, the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And then we've got a list of names. You've got the 10 sons of Haman. But I notice this at the end of verse 10. They laid no hand on the plunder. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the enemies were trying to get more people to destroy the Jews by saying you get to lay hands on the plunder if you do this. And the Jews don't take advantage of that. They don't do the reverse and take the plunder. It's interesting. So Esther does ask in verse 13 for one more day of this. Afraid that people might use the next day to try to come after the Jews. And so she's given one more day. This was decreed. Now notice this in verse 16. The rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. So this was an incredible day. They're going to feast. They're going to celebrate this. And they're going to hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. I don't know to what extent they still celebrate this, but it's a religious holiday, not a religious holiday, it's a Jewish holiday called Purim, P-U-R-I-M. And you get that name. This is the end of verse 24. He had cast pur, P-U-R, that is cast lots to crush and destroy them. So they use that idea of pur, where he cast the lots for the day, and they named their holiday Purim after that casting of lots. So that's how they remember it. So verse 27, they firmly obligated their offspring and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time appointed every year. Okay, any thoughts through chapter 9? Anything you would like to share? Anything? Any questions? Yeah.
So in chapter 2, verse 10, it says, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal.
Yeah.
And so nobody knew except Mordecai up until
There you go.
the meeting there. And also, the day was supposed to be that the Jews were wiped out and all their stuff is taken. It turns out that the Jews' enemies are defeated.
That's right. Yeah, what a reversal, right?
And I think it remained that way until after Haman was killed. And it says that she told Mordecai came into the house because she told the king that the way I take it, she told them they were Jews. She told him they were Jews.
Yeah. Yeah.
So up until that point, nobody knew. That's the way I understand it.
Yeah. All right. So chapter 10 is very short. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with a multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. It's really interesting to me. It's almost as if not as soon as, but within relatively short period of time, historically, Daniel is gone, and he was basically second in command in Babylon because he had been exalted so high. Now the Persians, Mordecai steps right into that role and is able to have a lot of power and influence. I like this. He sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. That's why Mordecai was taken care of, because he was seeking the welfare of God's people. I think that this might be a good time to ponder the value of the Book of Esther in a moment like we are in. I think that Esther is a good book to consider from a modern day perspective of how God works in the world. I think, we don't have the name of God written in the book of Esther, but he's all over the place. And I think sometimes maybe we would like for there to be a greater demonstration, right? We would like to see clearer evidence that God is at work in something. And I think we can draw the lesson from the book of Esther is you don't even know what he's up to, right? We don't even see the big picture of what he's involved in. And all that is to say is that God's going to preserve his people. It may not be in a situation like with Esther and Mordecai where the people's lives are physically protected. But God will have his people. And ultimately his purpose in having the people will be fulfilled. So I think, somebody told me, and I think I've said it here before, we have all of these concerns, and I think rightfully so from a physical point of view about other nations and what's that going to look like? Is Russia going to be the problem or China going to be the problem? And I heard somebody say one time, it may very well be that China crushes the United States and in Christ crushes China, right? It may very well be that the United States doesn't stand forever, but that the kingdom of God, what's it going to do? It's going to last forever. Right? The people of God, the real people of God, are going to last forever, whether it's in earthly terms or in spiritual terms. And I would say that as long as the earth remains, God will have a people, and perhaps earth side, but at least glory side. So I know that's the case because that's the promise God has made. So the book of Esther, I think, does help us think about that we are limited on the ways and places that we have control over the governing powers of the world. But literally, Xerxes, king of Ahasuerus, was the most powerful man on the planet. And he was still used by God to be a preservation for the people in the face of Haman, who is the second most powerful man on the planet. In the face of him, God still was able to use Esther and Mordecai in order to bring about their salvation. And so that I think that's helpful for us to think about. Anybody else have a good lesson that we can draw or something that you would like for us to ponder here?
Well, I think there's something to say there too for the courage that Esther and Mordecai both shown within the scope of what you're talking about.
Right.
God's going to have his people, but as his people, we need to be Esther's and Mordecai's as far as their courage and their willingness to stand toe to toe with enemies.
Yeah, I was more struck by Mordecai this time studying through than I had been because it's the book of Esther, and Esther is obviously the person who's right at the hinge of all this. But I was struck with the mentorship and the guidance of Mordecai and all this, and so that's kind of an amazing part of it. All right, so Sunday night, I believe we're going back to the book of Ezra, right? So we should be ready to pick up in Ezra 7. So is that right? I think it's Ezra 7, if I remember correctly. The difference is, so Ezra 1 through 6 was about that pre-Esther period, right? Basically, it ends with the temple being rebuilt in 516. That story kind of just pauses for about 50 years or so, and we're going to come back to that as Ezra's group is going to make its return, and that's what we'll read about in chapter 7. So we've got the temple rebuilt. Now Ezra's going to come in. When I say rebuild the people, he's going to try to get them back into functioning in a way where they're following the law more correctly. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.